All right, let's bring in Joseph Moreno, former federal prosecutor and fellow at the National Security Institute, to talk about this. Joseph, 37 charges. Could that list actually be added to in the future?
Hi, Morella. Well, good point. It's not totally uncommon to see superseding indictments where additional charges are added to initial charges like these. So if the government digs up additional information, or as it's basically preparing its case, comes up with alternate theories for what could have happened, you could certainly see additional indictments and additional charges that Donald Trump has to face.
Okay, so let's take a look at the charges as they stand right now. Of course, they involve classified documents which turned up at his Mar-a-Lago residence in Florida. 31 charges related to withholding that information, national defense information. 5 charges related to concealing the classified documents, and 2 charges related to making false statements to the FBI. Of the charges you see, which is the most serious?
It's probably the false statements. I think that Donald Trump, had he possessed the documents and simply given them back when the government demanded them, I don't think any of this would be happening. I think they could have both walked away, saved face, and say, you know what? No harm, no foul. The property is back in the hands of the government. That's it. I think it's the lying in the face of being given a subpoena, basically saying, I've given everything back. The government obviously felt otherwise, sent the FBI in, and they found over 100 documents still in his possession. So I don't know how he gets out of that one. It's one thing to say he thought he was entitled to the documents in the first place. It's another to say, I lied to the FBI, or I lied to a grand jury in the face of a subpoena, and I had a good reason for doing that. That's going to be the tricky one to get out of.
Okay, so what do you make of the other evidence in the case so far? We talked about the boxes being brought out of the Mar-a-Lago residence, but we also saw where those boxes were put inside of the residence, at some point in a storage room, at some point in a bathroom, on a stage in the ballroom. I mean, how does that add to the case of holding on to the documents?
Well, it certainly adds to the sort of dramatic nature of the case, right? Because, seeing them with boxes turned over and seeing them stacked in a shower and in a ballroom, it's all sort of absurd. But the fact is, they shouldn't have been anywhere there at all. So whether they were stacked neatly in the closet or thrown all over their bathroom floor, it doesn't really matter. The point is, the president never should have taken those boxes of classified documents. They were government property. And when he was asked to give them back, he should have complied. And that's why he's in trouble.
It would have made a difference, however, I imagine, if those documents were stored in a vaulted room, somewhere where they were locked up and, Joe Blow could not get access to them.
It might make a little better in his argument about why he wasn't careless in handling them, but there's no location at Mar-a-Lago which is properly set up to hold classified documents. There's no SCIF, what we call SCIF. It doesn't exist. So again, whether he had them in a more secure location, like a locked closet or something, it really wouldn't matter. He should not have had those documents, and he should have turned them back over. And the fact is, I was surprised to see that it looks like there was some pretty serious information in there about the country's national defense and its military vulnerabilities and things like that. So, again, he should not have had those documents, and now he's going to pay the consequence for it.
Definitely things that you don't want outsiders to get their hands on, information that can be sold for profit, for example. What are the possible defenses, then, in a case like this?
Well, you've heard a lot over the last few days about the Presidential Records Act. So Donald Trump is going to make a legal argument, it sounds like, right off the bat, that he was entitled to keep those documents, that they were property of him as a former president. He had the ability to declassify them, and therefore they were his to keep. And I think the government may have made a stumble in the fact that they don't ever mention the Presidential Records Act in the indictment. I think if I was charging it, knowing that would be raised, I would have tried to nullify it right away. They didn't do that. So that does raise the question of, okay, maybe they do think that this could be challenged on some basis. So I think there's going to be a lot of that. The only other thing I can think of is that he says something along the lines that he wasn't aware that he had the documents, or he thought he gave them back and he relied on lawyers or his assistants to do it. That's going to be a tough one, because it clearly seems that they have statements he made indicating that he knew boxes were being moved around when the remainder of them were being returned by the subpoena. So I think there's going to be a lot of legal wrangling. There'll also be a lot of sort of, well, what about Hillary Clinton? What about Joe Biden? Why weren't they charged? We're going to hear a lot of that, but those are political defenses, not legal ones.
Okay, so they're political defenses, but how is his case different from the case of Hillary Clinton, who used a private server for email, some of which was classified, or Joe Biden, when some documents that were classified in nature were found at his residence? How is this case different?
Well, and both those cases were wrong. I mean, I think a lot of people think that Hillary Clinton probably should have had some consequences for what she did. And the Joe Biden case, he shouldn't have had those documents either, whether they were in his garage or wherever. He had no right to have those documents. But I think the big differentiator we're going to hear from the government is that in those cases, those individuals were largely cooperative, that when they effectively got caught, they owned up, they sat down with the FBI, they said, okay, we're going to come clean. Here you go. Here's everything. I think that's the difference. Whereas Donald Trump, it seems like, was absolutely defiant to the end. And again, he had many, many months to give these documents back. And ultimately, when the government got tired of saying, please, can we have them back, and sent the FBI in to get them, that's the difference. So I think that's what he's going to have to say is, if you were entitled to have those documents, why didn't you just say so? Why did you play this game about giving some of them back but keeping the rest? And
has anywhere through his lawyers or in speeches he's given, has he ever referred to why he kept those documents?
I think he's intimated that they were his property under the Presidential Records Act, that he feels entitled to keep them, that basically anything that he put his hands on while he was president was his to keep. And I think that's the theme we're going to keep hearing, and that he'll refer back to some prior cases, going back to the Richard Nixon era of when the Presidential Records Act was passed. He'll say the Espionage Act is 100 years old and not applicable here, and it's the Presidential Records Act that should govern. So I think we're going to hear a lot of that.
Will he have to rebuild his legal team for this case? I know a couple of his lawyers quit when that indictment was released.
I mean, I happen to know Todd Blanche very well. We served together at a law firm for several years. He's a very talented lawyer, but he's a New York lawyer. Donald Trump will absolutely need Florida defense counsel for this case. So he is going to be doing some rebuilding. And from what I hear, there aren't a lot of people that are willing to take the case at this point. He doesn't have the greatest track record for how he treats his attorneys.
Yeah. The judge, of course, is someone Donald Trump appointed. Tell me some more about Aileen Cannon.
Well, I mean, it's going to be a stretch to say that she should have to recuse herself just because Donald Trump appointed her. Because, look, either he's going to get a Trump-appointed judge or some other Republican, or he's going to get an Obama or Biden-appointed judge or some other Democrat. So either way, there's that argument that a judge can't be fair if they're the wrong political party. I think the judge has to be given a chance. There's really no reason I've heard that she should recuse herself. And I think my guess is she will go out of her way to show how fair she can be to both the prosecution and the defense. So my guess is she's here to stay.
Joseph Moreno, good to have you on this, sir. Thanks very much for sharing some of your time and your expertise.
Thanks. Great to be with you.